The next cause of degradation of biodiversity and ecological systems that we'll discuss is deforestation and the destruction of carbon sinks. This is in the form of logging and things like illegal mining, and this might be something you're not familiar with. You can see here that logging has been continuing for the last 12 years at least. Logging has been a problem in tropical systems for a very long time, and you can see that 2019 and 2020 were pretty big years for logging. One of the biggest problems with logging and this ecosystem fragmentation is that when you take out trees and you change the ecosystem in these tropical habitats, you actually change the fundamental way that the hydrological cycle works. So on the top left, you can see a map where the darker green areas are intact ecosystems, but those lighter green areas, which is actually about a quarter of that entire area, is lighter green, and those are areas that humans have clear-cut or altered the forest in a way that it's completely changed. And what happens is that when the forest is removed, the trees can no longer maintain high levels of moisture and high levels of humidity, and so the surrounding ecosystem gets a lot drier. That drying out effect starts to penetrate into the edges of these forests, and so all around the edges of these intact rainforests, you have areas that have lower humidities and less rain. The result of these drier areas is that when farmers or people that are clear-cutting these forests, they burn their crops or they burn forests in order to clear-cut it, those fires are now getting out of hand because there's been so much drying and change in the ecosystem that the forest can no longer buffer itself against the fires. And remember, these are not fire-adapted forests. Fires are not common in tropical wet forests, and so when they burn, there's an incredibly profound impact and a complete destruction of those ecosystems. What we've seen is in the last few years, these fires have become more and more out of control, more and more common, and they are starting to reveal the big changes that are occurring throughout tropical regions, including our South American Amazonian rainforests. Here is a map at night showing all the different fires that were occurring during a peak season in 2019. The consequences of entering these hyper-diverse habitats and interfacing with these hyper-diverse habitats is not just the loss of carbon sinks and the loss of biodiversity. It's also a direct threat to human beings and our health. What do I mean by that? Well, these ecosystems that are hyper-diverse are not just reservoirs for different species of animal, they're also reservoirs for different kinds of disease. We are suffering the consequences of this right now as a species. The COVID-19 pandemic is an emerging disease that is the direct result of interacting with biodiversity from hyperdiverse tropical forests. In this case, it was a bat. Bats are the cause and the root of a lot of different diseases. This is an animal that we probably shouldn't be interacting with, that should be left alone living in a hyperdiverse ecosystem. But the more and more that people enter these hyperdiverse forests and the more and more deforestation happens, the more likely people will start to interact with these animals, either to eat them or just out of curiosity. And that's where we have the danger of disease crossing over from these animals into human systems. COVID-19 is an example of that, but Ebola is also something that came from bats. The HIV virus came from likely bushmeat from chimpanzees. We have malaria. We have a lot of different diseases that have reservoirs that stay in these natural systems, and they only emerge when people start to enter these hyperdiverse systems and start to mess around. This example on the right is a paper that illustrates the relationship between deforestation and increased rates of malaria. This is another paper I like because it It's very simple and straightforward, and it's describing the relationship between Lassa fever, which is a fever that occurs in West Africa. It describes the relationship between deforestation and Lassa fever just very, very clearly in this flow chart. And basically, you have a natural habitat. When you have deforestation through tree cutting or bush burning or urbanization, you're destroying the habitat of rodents. Those rodents seek refuge in homes and dwellings and places that are also occupied by people. And when you have that overlap and interaction, people encounter rodent droppings, they urine, and that's where they encounter the virus, Lassa fever. And so this is just a straightforward, clear path, and just one of many, many, many examples of zoonotic diseases that are locked away in biological diversity, but then we enter these hyperdiverse systems, and then we expose ourselves to these new diseases. And COVID-19 is a perfect example of exactly that pattern. Another cause of deforestation that you may not be familiar with is the illegal mining of gold throughout these western regions of Amazonia. This is a problem in Peru and a lot of these rivers that border Bolivia and Brazil. And the cause of this is something that you're likely not familiar with. So here's the headline from the Miami Herald, and it says, "How drug lords make billions smuggling gold to Miami for your jewelry and phones." So that's a fantastic headline, but let's unpack the exact reason this is happening and the cause of this. So basically, you have narcos in different areas along the Andean foothills in South America that are making illegal money from growing coca leaves and turning that into cocaine. Once they make money from cocaine, they have dirty money, and they need to somehow launder that illegal money. They transform that money into somehow economically transparent legal money. And so to do that, they oftentimes lend the money to people who would like to buy mining equipment. Once they have that money, they buy mining equipment, and they'll pay back that debt with gold. So once they collect that gold, they then give that gold to the narcos to pay for the mining equipment. So the narcos have just transformed their illegal money into something that's easier to move around, and it's a more ubiquitous value. Gold is valuable all over the world. That illegal gold enters U.S. markets and other international markets, and it's not clear how or where, but that gold is contributing strongly to the U.S. economy. That gold is sourced from these illegal mining operations, and these illegal mining operations are absolutely destroying these upper reaches of tributaries throughout Amazonia. This is the mining process, and you can see that these mining barges are equipped with siphons, and they just chew away at the edges of these rivers and suck up mud, and they suck up soil and dirt. What they do with that mud is they combine the mud with toxic chemicals like mercury, and they extract the small amounts of gold that occur in that mud using these toxic chemicals. Those toxic chemicals are then dumped into the river or in these massive mining pits, and the little gold that is collected is then used to fund the entire operation. This is an intact river system. This is what a river usually looks like from above. There's a little bit of deforestation here, but it's probably not super obvious. But after illegal miners occupy an area for any length of time, the rivers start to look like this, and it's pot-marked with all of these different like ponds filled with toxic waste, and that waste is permeating through the river. It's not only killing animals directly through habitat loss and fragmentation, but it's also poisoning and contaminating a lot of species that live within the river, both downstream and there at these sites. A lot of the fish that are migratory, that move throughout these rivers to breed, are then contaminated, and those fish are eaten by the surrounding communities. And so what we're finding is that there's an increase in birth defects and health issues in communities along the river, and even in communities of voluntarily isolated tribes that live in areas that are separated and protected from these outside populations. Those populations are experiencing the effects of contaminated fish, because those fish are migrating upstream to these communities and affecting populations that have been in isolation for hundreds of years. The last cause of degradation of biodiversity that we'll talk about are these enigmatic declines. And these are declines that don't have a very well understood or a single root cause, but again, I put that in quotes because they usually always end up being caused by humans in one way or another. One of those enigmatic declines is in populations of insects, and this is likely one of the most jarring enigmatic declines, because we really do rely on insects and their ecosystem services they provide in order to do a lot of different things. And so if we look at this graph on the bottom left, we can see the percent of insect species that are decreasing versus increasing and stable is shown in red. So if you have a red amount under these insects, it's showing that that is the percentage of those species that are undergoing decreasing numbers. In Coleoptera, the beetles, about 60% of the species measured of coleopterans are undergoing declines. Hymenoptera, that includes bees that pollinate our crops, about 45 to 50% of hymenopterans are undergoing declines. All of these orders of insects are undergoing decreasing numbers. Insects aren't the only group that have undergone enigmatic declines. The bird populations in North America have been dropping over the last 40 years. And you can see on the left the change in number of billions of birds has dropped substantially to a present-day loss of 3 billion birds. In the middle, we can see the losses broken down by habitats, what habitats are experiencing the biggest losses. We can see that grasslands, boreal forests, that suggests that these habitats that are being used by humans are where we're seeing a lot of the drops in American avifauna and American bird diversity. Here we've broken down the loss of birds by genre. We can see that the sparrows, wood warblers, blackbirds, old world sparrows have all been hit pretty hard. I'll let our friend and colleague and fellow scientist John Terborg talk about a couple of anecdotal experiences in his research career where he has either firsthand or through some of his colleagues' work begun to see these declines occurring in songbirds throughout the New World.
I can tell you about another case also involving one of my former students. This is John Faubourg. He and I in 1972, I think it was, or 71 or 72, I don't remember which year, we were in Puerto Rico, and toward the end of the trip we wound up in the Guanica State Forest, which is in the southwestern corner of Puerto Rico. We set up mist nets, and I think about 40% of the birds we caught, and we caught quite a lot of birds, were overwintering migrants from North America, things like redstarts and black and white warblers. And incredibly, John went back for the next 42 years, every year, and ran those net lines for 42 years. And over that time, the number of North American migrants just went down, 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 and the last few years, zero. Zero. Went from 40% of all the birds to zero.
Amphibians have also experienced enigmatic declines recently, and here's a map of species richness of amphibians. You can see that there are a lot of different species that occur in the Amazon basin, and we also have equatorial regions of Africa with high species richness, as well as Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific islands. So these are all areas where we have a strong bed of amphibian diversity, and these are areas that we would want to protect and we wouldn't want to see declines. Unfortunately, we've recently experienced a massive drop in amphibian diversity in numbers as a result of this fungus called chytrid. And chytrid fungus has spread through the world quite quickly and decimated populations throughout the globe. You can see here that areas in Mesoamerica and South America were hit hardest, and the short of this graph is that if you see red or magenta, those are entire species that are presumed extinct. The tan bars represent species that have experienced a greater than 90% loss. And so while there's incredible loss, that I think the most striking thing about these losses is that we have such high rates of extinction. These are species and genre that we'll never replace. This has occurred quite heavily in the New World, but we're seeing declines all over the globe. Amphibian declines are something that has gone under the radar for the most part. There's a lot of other issues that get a lot more airplay, but if you look at it from a species diversity number, I would say that amphibians have experienced the worst extinction event of all genre of animal. So what can we do to address these problems? I just named a ton of different issues that have been imparted on this world, on ecosystems, on biodiversity at the hands of humans. So us being part of this global community, how can we help change this for the better? Well, one is we can use less carbon to help mitigate global warming. Some of the easiest ways to do that are to drive or support electric vehicles, to bike more, to use public transportation, to use less fossil fuels in our transportation and daily lives. Another way to reduce the amount of carbon that we use is to eat less meat. We looked at the distribution of croplands and the inefficiencies of a meat diet, and so if you eat less meat, you'll use less carbon. We can also use more renewable energies and support projects, initiatives, or our own personal use of renewable energies like solar or wind or other methods of making renewable energy versus using energy sourced from fossil fuels. To address things like illegal mining and deforestation, you can avoid buying gold from unclear sources or participating in the valuation of gold. That can be kind of complicated and difficult to do, but if you can buy gold from someone locally who you know where they got the gold. There's a lot of contemporary gold miners that mine gold in areas here in North America that use far less destructive methods to get that gold. If you buy gold from them, you can be sure that that gold didn't pass through the hands of illegal gold miners and isn't contributing to this cocaine and mining kind of cycle that is destroying the rainforest. You can also avoid buying smuggled illicit drugs. Those are also directly contributing to this cycle. Another thing you can do is become a researcher and continue the research into the effects of human impacts on biodiversity and ecological systems. As we proceed into this new world, we're going to need an army of scientists, and we're also going to need an army of communicators of data. Without the ability to communicate data and without the ability to understand data, it's very difficult to get any traction towards progress with any community. And so to address that further, we need more scientific literacy in all communities. We need to create educational plans and initiatives that are accessible to everyone, and we need education to be ubiquitous. I'll leave this lecture with the final words of encouragement from lecturer Ursula Valdez. She's a biologist from Lima, Peru, that has a lot of experience dealing with these challenges and addressing these big issues directly as a researcher, as a sole biologist, as a single person in a world of, it seems like, problems. She maintains a really great attitude. So I'm going to let her words close off this lecture, close off our semester, and I thank you all for participating in our introduction to biology.
But we could do it if we put the same passion, if we put the same effort. And you can be a legend for yourself. And I think that's the most important thing, is that you don't need to test or you don't need to prove to anybody that you can do something. You have to prove to yourself. And how do you do that? Is by seeing how others work hard. And you just do it. And we all have the same inspiration. We all have the same talent if we do work for it. And I think that new generations, we have so many now things that can help us that people before they didn't have. I admire a lot of people, but I don't ever feel like I cannot do it, you know? It's just a matter like how hard I try. And if we do try hard and we dedicate that, yes, we can.